The Tarkalian girl screamed in agony, purple blood oozing from her wounds, as she lay trapped and abandoned beneath the rubble, left for dead by her own kind. Human soldier George Cooper trudged through the war-ravaged alien streets, rifle ready, scouting for survivors in the eerie silence and acrid stench of smoke and death from the brutal battle between humans and Tarkalians. His squad would soon move out from this ruined city on planet Tarkus. George's eyes watered from the fumes as he navigated debris. Then a faint whimper caught his ear. He investigated and discovered the injured Tarkalian child, no more than 6, pinned under a collapsed wall, purple skin mottled with lacerations and bruises. The terrified alien girl looked up at George with amber eyes, clearly expecting the human to end her suffering with a bullet, as was standard protocol for these vicious enemy combatants who had committed such atrocities against human civilians. George hesitated, finger on the trigger. If he was discovered helping this alien, he would be branded a traitor and executed without mercy. But gazing into the helpless child's eyes, George's heart won over hatred. She was an innocent pup, not an enemy soldier. He slung his rifle and started digging the weakly protesting girl free, knowing he had to get her to safety before his squad returned. Her life now depended on his aid, and his ability to keep her concealed from his fellow humans, out for Tarkalian blood. George could not leave a child to die, no matter the species. Her only chance at survival was this single human's compassion overpowering his ingrained instinct to destroy the alien threat. In that moment, George's humanity outweighed all else. Broken chunks of concrete scraped George's fingers raw as he frantically pulled rubble off Vortis's tiny frame. The girl let out a pained yelp as he lifted a heavy slab off her leg. Gunfire crackled in the distance, each shot making George's heart race faster. He had to move now. "Up we go," George said, scooping Vortis into his arms. The child was lighter than he expected, her body shaking against his chest as he took off down the ruined street at a dead sprint. George's boots pounded over upturned pavement, his eyes desperately scanning the bombed-out buildings for any shelter. "There," he huffed, spotting a partially collapsed structure with an intact basement visible through a gaping hole. George put on a burst of speed, the muscles in his legs burning. Safety was just steps away when a sharp voice cut through the air like a knife. "Cooper, what the hell are you doing?" George skidded to a halt, instinctively twisting to put his body between Vortis and the newcomer. His squadmate Mike emerged from the shadows of an alley, rifle aimed at George's heart. Mike's eyes bulged as he took in the purple-skinned child cradled in George's arms. "Have you lost your mind? Put that thing down now." George held Vortis tighter, shaking his head. "She's just a kid, Mike. I'm not leaving her." Disgust twisted Mike's features into an ugly sneer. "It's a Tarkalian, Cooper. They butchered the Jenkins family, or have you forgotten? I ought to shoot you right here for treason." George's mind spun as he took a step back. Mike wasn't wrong. The Tarkalians had done unspeakable things, but the small broken body in his arms stirred something deep in George's chest. He met Vortis's pain-glazed amber eyes and made his choice. Letting out a roar, George charged forward, slamming into a shocked Mike like a freight train. The two men tumbled to the ground in a tangle of limbs and weapons. George scrambled to his feet first, Vortis still clutched to his chest, and sprinted for the ruined building. Mike's curses and the bark of his rifle chased George as he plunged through the hole into the cool dimness below. Heart in his throat, George scanned the basement, spotting a small storage room in the back. He squeezed inside, pulling the door shut behind him with a rusty squeal. In the sudden quiet, George slid down the wall to the floor, struggling to catch his breath. He could hear Mike moving around in the building above, boots crunching on debris. George hugged Vortis to his chest, praying silently that the other man wouldn't think to check this room. The girl had mercifully passed out, her head lolling against George's shoulder, still except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. In the faint light filtering in through cracks, George could make out the ugly gashes and mottled bruises covering her small body. With shaking hands, he fumbled in his pack for his meager first aid kit, suddenly grateful for the basic medical training all soldiers received. George knew that by saving this child, he had crossed a line he could never uncross. He was a traitor now, in the eyes of his squad, his entire species. But as he carefully cleaned and bandaged Vortis's wounds, George felt a calm settle over him, a sense of purpose that had been sorely lacking in the long years of this brutal war. He didn't know how, but he silently vowed to the unconscious child in his arms that no matter what, he would find a way to keep her safe. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds of battle above faded into an eerie silence. George cautiously emerged from the basement, Vortis draped limply over his shoulder. In the ruined street, smoke stung his eyes. He picked his way through debris, alert for any movement. He needed supplies if they had any chance of making it. George scoured the blasted shells of buildings, coming up with a few ration packs, a dented canteen, and a threadbare blanket. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he turned to leave, a metallic glint caught George's eye. Buried in rubble was the angular form of a Tarkalian hovercraft. Heart-pounding, George clawed away chunks of concrete, hardly daring to hope. To his amazement, the craft was intact. He heaved Vortis into the passenger seat and clambered in. After some desperate tinkering, the engine sputtered to life. George let out a breathless laugh as the hovercraft wobbled into the air. Maybe their luck was finally turning. The thought had barely crossed his mind when a shout rang out. George's head snapped up to see a human patrol rounding the corner, Mike in the lead. For a heartbeat, the two groups stared at each other in disbelief. Then Mike leveled his rifle and fired. Energy bolts seared past George's head. He wrenched the controls, sending the hovercraft careening wildly as more shots peppered its hull. The craft lurched drunkenly, but its powerful engine quickly outpaced the soldiers on foot. George didn't let up, pushing the hovercraft to its limits as they fled the ruined city. Only when the stark mountains rose ahead did he dare to breathe. Hours later, warning lights flashed on the console as the power cells neared depletion. George spotted a cave system and brought the hovercraft down, praying it was uninhabited. As he carried Vortis inside, she began to stir, a pained whimper escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. Then they landed on George's face and widened in sheer terror. Vortis thrashed weakly, keening in her language. George hastily set her down, backing away with his hands raised. "It's okay," he said, keeping his voice low and soothing. "I'm not going to hurt you." But Vortis scrambled backwards, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. She clearly expected the human soldier towering over her to end her life at any moment. At a loss, George slowly lowered himself to the cave floor, trying to make himself less threatening. He fumbled in his pack and held out a ration bar. Vortis stared at it uncomprehendingly, then back at George, confusion warring with fear in her eyes. George took a bite of the bar, chewed slowly, and swallowed. He held it out again. "See, it's safe. You need to eat." Long moments crawled by. Then, tentatively, Vortis reached out and snatched the bar, retreating to the far wall of the cave. She nibbled at it suspiciously, gaze never leaving George. He sighed, running a hand over his face. They were fugitives now, outcasts from both their kinds, with only each other to rely on. Convincing Vortis to trust him would be a long, slow road. But as he watched the injured child devour the meager rations, determination settled in George's gut. For better or worse, their fates were entwined now. He would keep Vortis safe, even if it meant making enemies of his own species. George just hoped he was up to the task. In the days that followed their narrow escape, George and Vortis fell into a cautious rhythm within the mountain cave. Each morning, George ventured out to search for sustenance and supplies, scouring the harsh landscape for anything that might aid in their survival. Meanwhile, Vortis remained concealed in the depths of their rocky shelter, her small body slowly mending from the trauma inflicted by the war that raged beyond their refuge. Despite the chasm of language and culture that divided them, George devoted himself to the care of the young Tarkalian. He brought her clear water from a nearby stream, the liquid soothing her parched throat. With gentle hands, he changed the dressings on her wounds, applying medicinal salves scavenged from the wreckage of their flight. As the days turned into weeks, Vortis's guarded demeanor gradually softened. A tentative trust began to bridge the gap between the unlikely companions. One evening, George presented her with a small, hand-stitched doll, its mismatched fabric scraps forming a whimsical patchwork. Vortis's amber eyes widened, and for the first time, a genuine smile flickered across her purple features, a fleeting moment of innocent joy amidst the shadows of conflict. But their fragile equilibrium was not to last. On a grey morning, George returned from his daily foraging to find the mouth of the cave surrounded by a phalanx of Tarkalian soldiers, their energy rifles trained on the entrance with ruthless precision. At their head stood a towering figure, his bearing regal and his expression etched with barely restrained fury, Vortis's father, a formidable Tarkalian commander. Recognition dawned in the commander's eyes as they fell upon George, swiftly replaced by a searing rage. In his mind, there could be only one explanation for a human soldier in such close proximity to his missing child: kidnapping. With a bellowed command, he ordered his troops to open fire, heedless of the terrified cries that echoed from within the cave. George barely managed to fling himself behind a boulder as a hail of energy bolts scorched the rock face, the air crackling with their deadly heat. Heart pounding, he realized the hopelessness of his predicament. One man, unarmed and alone, against a squad of elite Tarkalian warriors. Despair rising in his throat, George prepared himself for the inevitable end, determined to face it with courage, even as the soldiers advanced. But the final volley never came. Instead, a piercing scream rent the air, a sound of such anguish that it stilled even the hardened Tarkalian soldiers. George risked a glance around his boulder to see Vortis, dragging herself to the lip of the cave, her small face contorted in desperation as she screamed for her father to stop. The commander froze, his weapon lowering a fraction as he stared at the daughter he had believed lost. Heedless of the pain that racked her battered body, Vortis poured out her story in a torrent of Tarkalian, her small hands gesturing frantically to the human crouched beneath the onslaught. Though the words were alien to George's ears, their meaning was clear. Vortis was pleading for the life of the man who had saved her own. As her impassioned tale reached its climax, the commander's stern facade cracked, a warring mix of emotions playing across his angular features. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his rifle, signaling his soldiers to do the same. George remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe, as the commander strode forward to gather his daughter into his arms, cradling her as if she were spun from glass. Then, with a curt motion, the commander beckoned for George to follow. Warily, George fell into step behind the Tarkalian leader, flanked by the watchful soldiers as they marched to a waiting shuttle. As he climbed aboard, Vortis's eyes met his own, a silent plea in their amber depths. The shuttle lifted off, carrying them into an uncertain future, one in which the lines between enemy and ally had become irrevocably blurred. The shuttlecraft jostled as it touched down, the docking clamps locking into place with a heavy clunk. George's heart raced as the hatch hissed open, revealing a phalanx of armored Tarkalian soldiers, their energy rifles aimed squarely at his chest. Rough hands seized George, dragging him down the ramp. He stumbled, boots scrabbling on the metal deck plates. The soldiers hauled him through the cavernous hangar, past rows of gleaming attack ships poised for launch. George's mind spun as he was shoved into a sterile chamber, the walls lined with view screens. High-ranking Tarkalian officers glared at him from a raised dais, their purple faces twisted with loathing. And there, in the center, Vortis's father, his amber eyes burning with barely restrained fury. George squared his shoulders, meeting the commander's gaze head-on even as his pulse pounded in his ears. He opened his mouth, a defiant retort on his lips, but the words died in his throat as a side door slid open. Vortis stumbled into the room, clean and clad in pressed Tarkalian robes. Her eyes locked on George, and she let out a strangled cry, darting across the chamber to throw her arms around his leg, clinging to him with desperate strength. The Tarkalian officers muttered, shifting uncomfortably as the human soldier and the Tarkalian child embraced. Vortis's father stepped forward, his expression unreadable. George Cooper, he growled in halting English. Your actions in saving my daughter were commendable, but you are still an enemy combatant. You must answer for your species' crimes. He gestured sharply. The view screens flickered, resolving into a live feed of a human colony, its buildings clustered beneath an azure sky. George frowned, a sinking feeling in his gut. Then the Tarkalian warships screamed into view, disgorging swarms of fighters and dropships. Plasma bombs rained down, the colony vanishing in blossoms of fire. The ground trembled, buildings collapsing into rubble. "No!" George shouted, straining against the soldier's grip. "Stop this, they're civilians!" The commander watched impassively as the bombardment continued. "This is retribution, human, for the occupation of our world, for the atrocities your kind has committed." His gaze bored into George. "I am told your own family resides in that colony, or did." Anguish ripped through George's chest as he stared at the screens, the human settlement disintegrating before his eyes. His family, his friends, all gone in a hellish instant. Tears blurred his vision. "Please," he choked out, "please stop." Vortis's father held up a hand. The screens went dark. He turned to George, something like pity in his eyes. "I offer you a choice, George Cooper. Renounce your loyalties. Leave Vortis here to be raised as a Tarkalian, her memories of you erased. Do this, and you may return to what remains of your people." George shook his head mutely, bile rising in his throat. Abandon Vortis, the child who trusted him, betray the bond they had forged through pain and desperation. The commander's face hardened. "Then you will die, here now." Vortis let out a wail, understanding enough. She clung to George, keening. George knelt slowly, gently detaching her arms. He cupped her face, memorizing every detail. "Stay strong, little one," he whispered. "Never forget that there are those who care for you no matter what." George stood, holding the commander's gaze as he nodded once. The soldiers seized his arms, dragging him towards a dark doorway, an execution chamber. Behind him, Vortis's screams echoed, begging him not to go. George squeezed his eyes shut, hot tears tracking down his face. The hiss of the door and the clamp of restraints barely registered. As the barrel of an energy rifle pressed against his skull, a strange calm descended. In the end, faced with an impossible choice, George had held fast to his humanity. Their brief connection, that fragile bridge between foes, could not end this war. The cycle of violence and vengeance would roll on. But for one shining moment, a human and a Tarkalian had reached across the divide, had seen each other as more than enemies. And that, George thought as the rifle whined to life, was worth this fate. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.